Chapter 21 River Ridge. Haille's body was lead when he woke. A weight many times greater than his own kept him down in the mud, the weight of a millstone, the weight of a mountain, it might have been, for how weak he was. For a long time all he could do was breathe. The effort of movement, the rising and falling of his chest felt as if it would exhaust him. He stared upwards and realized that the bowl of the sky was splintered into countless fragments, the cracks yawning open wide and black. It was a few minutes, or maybe hours that passed before he realized that what he stared at was not a subterranean cavern, but rather an overcast sky, cut up by the bare branches of trees stripped of leaves by the wind and season. It dawned on him slowly then that he was not quite dead, that he was improbably alive. He was not sure if he had just woken up to die, but he was starting to recognize the fatigue that came like clockwork after a seizure. But the cold wrapped his body completely, cold that even covered his head, encasing it like a helm, a hood. He heard the swirl and drip of water. He turned his head only to have coldness splash his face and water invade his lungs. His body showed renewed vigor as he coughed, and suddenly he was lucid again and struggling to rise out of the creek bed where he had been left to drown. The air on his soaking body was little better than water. He shivered, his teeth clacking. More water swirled, the creek turning muddy with his movements toward shore. Crouched on the bank, he regarded the stream with a dread too great for him to feel relieved. All they had needed to do was to have tossed him a little farther, or face down. Inches would have done it. But as it were, they had been too rushed or too scared of his own condition to touch him in the way it would have taken to finish him. He had to crawl out of the mud. He knew that much. He was far too weak to care how it covered his body, stuck to his hands, forearms, torso as he crawled through it. The bank itself was insurmountable, but he surprised himself, finding a reserve of strength to take hold of exposed tree roots and draw himself under the cottonwood branches to sleep. Just to sleep. When he awoke the second time, it was pain that replaced fatigue. Pain from the blows that he had sustained. And pain in his gut. Hunger. It was night, the bullfrogs loud in their nocturnal chorus. This time was different. This time he immediately moved to get up, even though the pain struck back at him as relentless and complete as the blows themselves. He had to stop halfway to his knees, surprised by the places pain found on his body, his back, his neck, the crest of his hip, his thumb, and the third and fourth fingers of his right hand, even his face. But to stop moving was to invite stiffness and more aching, more cold, so he staggered up. He had walked several steps before he realized he was headed for what was left of the camp of tents. He was practically among them before he worried of being spotted by other escapees or by Redmont's men, but he found he did not care, or at least did not care enough in the face of cold and hunger. Many of the tents had been torn down. The far side of the camp had been burned, and the only things left were smoking ashes and empty stakes. The closest tents to him, those farthest from the center of the camp, had survived. Haille decided he would go no further than those. He ducked inside and rifled through what belongings were left. He pulled off his sodden clothes, more pain as he stretched and strained, and put on a pair of breeches and a wool shirt. The former too long and the latter too short, but they were dry and warm. His boots had been stolen and there were no extras he could find. He would have to flee barefoot, and fleeing was the only plan. He knew he had to get away from the Greystone estate, from the sight of such unraveling, from such a defeat, from such agony, and if nothing else, he had to keep moving to stay warm. As he lifted the flap of the tent, raindrops began to dance on the canvas and strike up a patter on the fallen leaves of the forest floor. A tumble of thunder rolled overhead. Haille ripped free the canvas of the next tent he passed, wrapped it like a cloak about his body, and started east. The rain should have been a misery, but he welcomed it. Since a child he had loved storms, felt them somehow comforting. Yona had told him he used to cry at the thunder, not out of fear, but to be closer to it, closer to the rain. For some reason he associated it with his mother, although he had no memory of her, at least not one that he could recall. All he knew of her were stories and her grave, a monument in a cemetery surrounded by woods. In that moment, fleeing eastward, in bare feet, in stolen clothes, and reflecting upon his own broken family, he felt a potent longing for his friends, Katlyn, Val, and Cody. He would have even been glad to see that elk. This loneliness was worse than any physical pain he could ever feel. He heard his own voice, sobbing out to an indifferent, empty forest, and knew then that loneliness was not emptiness, but rather the full weight of the complete, uncaring world crushing down on his shoulders, a butterfly beneath a wagon wheel. That, in the end, would kill him, he imagined. But in the meantime, he decided to keep moving eastward, mostly out of habit, mostly to keep warm. Hours passed. The rain continued, a comfort and companion. He welcomed it, for it cleansed him of the mud caked on his body, softened the path under his feet, and emptied the world, so to speak. For in the rain there was not a rider or hunter searching for him, no travelers to take note of him and betray him to bounty hunters or other escapees bent on revenge. Not even wolves to track him, as they would surely remain in their dens. So he moved freely and invisibly across an abandoned landscape curtained by rain. Out here in the Eastlands, nothing seemed complete. It was a region of unclaimed lands where poor families set up farms on irregular plots. Some thrived, some did not. Those that failed were marked by sod buildings slowly melting back into the soil from which they came. The roads leading to their property overgrown with stationary traffic of knee-high weeds and other autumnal growth. But for every plot returning to the wild there was the occasional branch road that was still well trod, the ruts deeply worn so that on any other day, without rain, they would have been busy with carts, animals, and men coming and going. In the center of each homestead, Haille knew, would be a family thriving with the help and contact of other families. He wondered if the proximity of the wild made them closer. Was the irony that these farm communities enjoyed more solidarity than the closely packed residents of the city where anonymity ruled? He felt feverish, the emptiness of his stomach, a weakness radiating out of him into his limbs, a dizziness that grew worse with each movement of his head. Still he pressed onward, through the downpour, even as blood swirled in the footprints he left behind in the mud. The rain slackened in the afternoon. When he heard a rider coming from the west, he retreated into the trees on the side of the road. The rider, a young man, perhaps a courier, passed without spotting him. When Haille tried to rise again, his head spun and he had to lean against a tree and wait for some semblance of equilibrium to return. His skin was crawling with fever now, but he had a destination in mind. He just had to reach Rivertown, although he had no idea how near or far it was. But there he could find refuge. He could start over. He slept the night in the woods, drinking from streams. He dreamt of broken fences, roads of marching trees, and families with carts trying to find their way from a city encrusted in filth to the wild where green things grew freely. In the morning when he woke, his hunger had turned from a pain in his torso to a general malaise that was indistinguishable from the fever raging in his body. This day was white blindness, with a fog settled on the fields and in the forest so that he could see no farther than a few feet ahead. He found that he was too weak to stand and wondered if he could expire here in these trees. It would not be such a terrible place to pass, he thought, amid drifts of leaves the color of fire and sun, and cool, moss-softened stones and tree trunks. A voice reached through the thickness of the fog, accompanied by the clump of a hoof, the jingle of a bridle, and the groan of a wagon axle. The voice was that of a child, and Haille heard the deeper voice of an adult respond, even though he could not understand what was said. He stood, if what he was doing, doubled over, his chin on his chest, could be called standing. Wet leaves shuffled at his feet. He moved from one tree to the next, leaning heavily with hands covered in grime and nails dark with dirt. But he pushed forward. He could hear the cart as if it were right next to him, even if the road was maddeningly far away. He cursed his own efforts to hide from the road the day before as he stumbled over stones and roots. The ditch beside the road came into focus. He made no effort to step over its filthy trough and instead splashed through the stagnant water and threw himself down on the road, the edges of his vision turning black, the sound of the wagon so close. But he was unsure if it had already passed or was still approaching. He could not manage to stay conscious long enough to find out. This time he woke in a bed. It was warm, not the racking, trembling warmth of fever, but the soft, safe enclosure of blankets, bedding, and the accompanying sound of a fire. Haille tried to focus his eyes. He did not recognize the room, nor could he remember how he got there. He waited a few beats, relieved to be in the relative safety and comfort of a bed, indoors at that, and waited for his memory of the place and recognition to return. It didn't. The room did not resolve into one he knew. Nothing was familiar. The walls were made of irregular stones mortared together, the floor made of wood planks, the nail heads worn down to look like shiny coins. Through a square window he could see white clouds scudding across a cerulean sky. Next to the bed was a table that held a mug. Haille reached out a trembling hand to touch it. It still held traces of warmth. He took the handle, spilled some of the tea on the pillowcase, then drank it down, emptying the cup, his thirst taking precedent over any caution regarding what he was drinking. He set the empty mug down and shifted beneath the covers. Familiar aches and pains returned, but the severity had lessened. He leaned back and slept and woke, stringing together rests like gaps on a necklace of consciousness. The window rattled. It was windy outside. He was contemplating wrapping himself in a blanket and moving next to the fire when he heard footsteps and the door creaked open. She wore an indigo dress and her waist was wrapped by a wide belt, the silver buckle similar to the amulet on her neck, except the buckle was inlaid with polished bone, carved into some intricate shape of ancient meaning. In her hands was a large kettle that, from the way she hefted it with both hands, Haille could tell was full. "Good," she said in a firm voice. "The near-dead awakens." She passed by Haille, her coal-lined eyes studying him, and hung the kettle over the fire. She took a pot off the hob and dished out a thick stew that smelled of rosemary, chicken, and peppers into a wooden bowl that she handed to Haille. From some unseen place at the end of the bed, she produced half a loaf of brown bread. Haille found himself suffering from an embarrassment of riches, unsure what to eat first. Finally he tore at the bread, dipped it into the chicken stew, and crunched down on it, savoring the explosion of tastes and textures in his mouth, not to mention the pleasure of finally filling his stomach. The woman picked a few sticks from a wood carrier on the hearth, broke them and tossed them on the fire. By the time the flames had risen and she turned back to Haille, he had finished his first helping. "Starved," she said, taking the bowl and refilling it. He nodded his head with as much vigor as he could gather. "Thank you." He was not healed, but he was better by leaps and bounds by the time he finished his third helping. The woman sat on the end of the hearth, sipping her own cup of tea, looking from the fire to the window, then to Haille as he ate. She got up and took the empty bowl from him. He politely refused a fourth helping. "Your kindness is appreciated with gratitude I cannot express." Haille began to speak but broke off sobbing. He was not sure why, but his eyes turned to streams. He could find no words, but his reaction almost seemed expected on the part of the woman, who got up, sat down on the bed next to him, and placed her hands on the blanket covering his knees. There, she said. "You have been through a great deal. Here, let me tend to your stitches." "Stitches?" "Yes, you truly were worse for wear when you arrived. Let me see your head there. Had to cut away some of your hair." Haille realized his head was wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it gently. He could smell a pungent salve on it, and rose and wood smoke on her. He appreciated the attention but steeled himself against any oncoming pain. It was unnecessary. Her touch was soft, and after applying a different salve that looked and smelled a lot like honey, she replaced the bandages and patted his knees again. "Where am I?" "Why, I thought you knew. After all, you were the one who asked to be brought here." "I did?" "Well, if you consider one word a request, it was all you could say in your state." "What word was that?" "A name. Yonasale." "Yonasale?" "Yona," Haille said, breathing in deep, the smell of wood smoke and honey filling his nose. "Lady Yonasale," the old woman said. "Do you know her?" "You are lucky I do, and that the family of traders that found you did as well, and where to find her manor." "River Ridge? I'm at River Ridge?" "You are. Now, might I ask you how that name came to be on your lips?" "Yona, well, she is the closest person. She is like an adopted mother to me." "Then I think I know who that makes you." I'm Haille Hillbourne." His own name came slowly to him after so long playing a different role. But something told him it was safe to reveal his true identity to this woman. Something about her spoke of protection, authority, even power. She also seemed familiar. Perhaps it was her Rivertown accent, so much like Yonna's. "If I am at Riveridge, then you must be Lorna," he said, sitting up. "None other." Haille could not believe his luck. It was better than waking up in his own bed. He had made it to Rivertown alive and was at the estate of Yonna's with her mentor, whom he had never met but felt like he already knew. A knock sounded at the door and a young girl opened it. She had mahogany hair woven into thick braids and a long skirt with flowers sewn into its hem. She removed Haille's dirty dish without word and placed folded garments on the seat of a chair next to the window. Lorna thanked her. She nodded back, offered a nod to Haille, then left as quietly as she came. "You will need these," Lorna said, patting the pile of clothes. "But don't feel too hurried to leave bed. You'll still be weak. When was the last time you ate?" "I don't know," Haille said after some thought. "The last days are a blur." "Well," Lorna said, refreshing Haille's cup of tea, "why don't you start from what you do recall?" As long as he could remember, Haille had known Yonna, and as long as he had known Yonna, he had heard stories of her mentor, Lorna. She was a legend to him, yet a familiar one, not unlike an aunt or grandmother. His story tumbled out, starting back with Yonna and how upset she had been at him. Katlyn, his father, the Font, Annabeth, Annabelle, Garn, Vondales, Red, Rim, Goust, Val, and Cody, even the elk. Lorna listened without speaking, without changing expression, but never did he doubt that he held her full, concentrated attention. When he had finally finished, she sipped her tea. "A long journey, and not just by distance," she said. He was not sure exactly what she meant, but he was relieved to share it, relieved to have survived it, and relieved not to face judgment or condemnation for his many mistakes. If anything, Lorna showed sympathy in her tone as she got up, touched his knees once more, and said, "I will leave you to rest, but we will talk. Oh, how we will talk." Chapter 22. Lorna Caskell's. Haille spent the following days convalescing. Lorna ate the midday meal with him and brought herbal concoctions for him to drink that were sometimes sweet, but more often bitter. His fever faded and his strength came rushing back. Soon he was itching to explore and learn everything he could about Yonna's old home. He asked Sorel, the girl who had brought him water and firewood, to show him the rest of the house. Sorel was 5 years his junior and quiet, but he had been able to make her laugh and even gawk at a few sleight-of-hand tricks he had learned from court jesters. Eventually, she took him to the kitchen where the rest of the house staff worked, or simply met in order to visit or rest from work in the fields or the shops. Lorna was among them and made introductions. Haille met the whole household but was surprised to find it only consisted of about a dozen servants and their families. The entire staff ate in the adjacent hall for dinner that night, and Haille realized there were no real family members to serve. Here the servants were also the lords, even if they did not live like it. As he wandered back to his quarters that night, he found most of the rooms of the house were closed, the furniture covered in dust covers, the window blinds drawn, even the chimneys capped to keep out birds and bats. He surveyed the grounds the next day and found them similarly quiet, if well tended. The rose bushes were trimmed back in preparation for winter but still held a few blooms, dropping red, yellow, or pink petals to the ground. The manor house was modest in comparison to others he had seen on his journey. It was only one story and boasted only 2 wings that encircled a grassy courtyard. The stables, as Haille would have expected of an equestrian like Yonna, were indeed grand. Yet most of the stalls themselves were bare and unoccupied, except the 6 closest to the main door, and 2 of those were for oxen. The baking house and the scullery were boarded shut, all cooking taking place in the house kitchen. Only the smithy was busy, and most of its traffic came from customers from outside the estate who came through the main gate, through which Haille could see the tightly clustered buildings and rooftop balconies of Rivertown farther down the flat road. He had no desire to go into town yet, but he did walk outside the gate in order to turn and explore the east grounds of River Ridge. There, across a swale of grass, he glimpsed the swift-flowing Liam River, brother river to the Lynn, which he must have crossed while unconscious in the trader's cart. Barges floated on the sparkling water, the whistles of bargemen hailing one another carried to him by the wind. Even more striking were the mountains. He had heard stories of the Rimcur range, but never before had he set eyes upon them in the light of day. They were another legend, like Lorna, the borders of the kingdom and the realm only reachable in dreams, until now. Now they rose into the sky, jagged fields of white resting on a grey-blue canvas. Between them and the river were the red moors of Thestos. The sight of the mountains broke the spell of comfort that had settled over Haille in those past days. Now he was restless. He rubbed the place on his neck where his old pallet used to rest. It had been broken when the boys had beaten him. He didn't need it to remind him why he had started this journey. The mountains did that. He studied the peaks, wondering if one of them was more bright itself. If the mountain was so real, so could be the font, or so his logic went. But just looking at the snow-capped peaks and barren moors of Thestos covered in rusty heather, he felt a shiver come over him. That same feeling of desperation that had driven him as he had wandered, in a primitive, near-death state through the Eastlands, returned. He knew he would leave for the mountains, and he knew that this time he was going ahead alone. That night he followed Lorna as she slipped away from the dinner table to her own quarters. He carried 2 mugs of black root tea. He hated the stuff, but he had learned that Lorna loved the licorice-tasting brew. He caught her at her door. "You said we would talk." He handed her a mug. "Ah, so the time has come," she smiled. She opened the door and they stepped into what was her study and workshop. 2 of the walls were lined with slanting shelves of books packed so tightly that they looked as if they replaced the stone of the wall itself and held up the very ceiling. The other walls were replete with apothecary jars holding herbs, dried mushrooms, and desiccated lizards. The smells were overwhelming, so Haille was relieved when she led him into the adjacent room, which was furnished with couches and reading chairs angled around the fireplace. She took a seat in a worn, high-backed chair next to the fire and pointed to a smaller chair opposite. Haille took it, slid it closer to the fire, and bent down to pull a stool over for his feet. Lorna shook her finger at him. That is Sorel's. She will be coming presently." They settled. Haille was not sure how to begin, so he was grateful when Lorna did. Her eyes, sparkling like the silver around her neck, regarded him through the steam rising from her cup. "You are determined to complete this quest of yours." "I am. I must," she hummed to herself. As she had predicted, Sorel appeared at the door, holding some knitting to her chest, hesitating upon seeing Haille. "Come, my dear. Haille is joining us for our stories tonight." Sorel moved to take her stool by the fire. Haille realized he was but a guest in a customary nightly meeting. "Sorel, you are Lorna's apprentice, aren't you?" The shy girl smiled into her sewing and mumbled something that sounded like, "Yes." "Like Yona before her, and tonight, you," Lorna said. "I'm honored." "Now apprentices should have questions. Ask." Haille had many, and he asked the first one that came to mind. "The estate. Why is it so empty, abandoned?" "It is not abandoned. We are here, its caretakers." "But why are the rooms shut, unused, empty?" "Because it is a place of mourning. At least it is to your adoptive mother." "Why did she leave?" "She never told you?" "No." In the quiet that followed, the only sounds were the crackling fire and the click-click of Sorel's knitting needles. Haille continued, "Apprentices have questions. Mentors should have answers." Lorna smiled and slurped her tea. "Where to start?" "The beginning." "Oh, beginnings are delicate things," Lorna said into her cup. "You find they have a way of receding as you look back at them." She slurped again. Sorel was smiling. Haille had a feeling she had been subjected to similar word games in the course of her apprenticeship. Lorna started again. "Yona was married once." "Married?" Haille said, his head jerking back. "Yes." "I never knew." "Quarton was his name. He was a textile merchant, sold textiles throughout the kingdom and the wider realm. This was their home, and those were happy days." "These are happy days," Sorel said. "Yes, child, but these are the only days you have known. Before you, the manor was the centre of things in Rivertown. Dozens of people coming and going each day. Barges used to stop at the docks to trade, load, and unload." "What happened?" Haille asked. Lorna's face darkened. She cast her eyes to the floor and let them unfocus as if she were turning her gaze inward into some hidden source of pain and loss. Katlyn was murdered, set upon by bandits while hunting in the moors. When they brought his body back, the whole city mourned, but none more than his friends and family. Yona? Yona showed no outward signs of grief. Stoic she was, but I knew her. I knew the pain she was feeling, and I should have known what she would do next, but I was too lost in my own grief. Yona's heart was shattered, but her spirit not broken. She would not mourn passively. That has never been her way, not since she was the only girl on a barge, not since she was the first female captain. She wanted justice, and she knew others would try to stop her if she shared her plan, so she told no one. Instead, she slipped out that night and rode into the Thestos moors. It took her a few days and nights, but she tracked the thieves. There were 6 of them. Lorna shook her head. How they must have wished for greater numbers. Once she had their trail, she followed them, then waited for nightfall and slaughtered them. By herself? Lorna nodded. I gather she snuck up on the one taking watch, slit his throat, did the same to 3 others while they slept. The last 2 put up a fight, and she did not defeat them without being wounded herself. She was stabbed through the thigh, and her shoulder gashed, her head struck badly. But the cold fury of loss was in her, and only when they were all dead or dying did she collapse and weep. Only the ghosts of the moors left to listen to her howls. I imagine she would have expired there, simply given up. But her friend Rebecca went out into the moors to find her. Haille held his head in his hands, ran his fingers through his hair, down the back of his neck and around to his mouth. Katlyn, Rebecca, I've never heard of these people before. A life that is dead to her now. Rebecca was a cipher to many of us. I did not know her well myself, but a closer confidant Yona did not have. She was distinct looking, curly red hair, 1 green eye, 1 blue. Haille pressed his fingertips to his temples. Funny, my father said that one of the midwives who attended my mother the night I was born had the same features. He remembers her distinctly opening the door to the birth chamber, her sleeves rolled, her hands red with my mother's blood. They were not able to stop the bleeding. He said to me he knew things were going wrong by the look of fear in her mismatched eyes and the amount of blood on her hands. Interesting. Lorna stared into the fire for some time, the muscles in her jaw flexing. Sorrel hopped up as if responding to some invisible cue and refilled her cup. Thank you, dear. Well, it was Rebecca who sought out to find Yona, brought her back, holding her up in the saddle. We nursed her back to health, healing at least her physical wounds. The wounds of the heart, those are different, and those would only grow worse, for it was shortly after that Yona came to know she was with child. She never told me. The clicking of Sorrel's needles slowed. The wind blew at the top of the chimney, sucking sparks up into the draught. The same wind that started at the icy mountains and blew a cold path across the moorlands below. She has told few, for she lost the child. To fever? Stillborn, or so Rebecca said. I was away myself, tending to another complicated labour in the town that night. It was Rebecca who was her nursemaid, and Rebecca who stole the child's body away and buried her. We never knew where. It could have been close. Not as close as you would think. The land between the rivers to the north is hard rock. The Dreaded Harn, they call it. Not enough water there to drown a man, not enough wood to hang him, and not enough earth to bury him. But we'd never know. We never saw Rebecca again after that. Her disappearance after Yona's other losses was too much. It was a miracle she did not die of grief in those weeks. But in Katlyn's place she became Chancellor of Rivertown, and the city thrived as she threw herself into her work. Still her heart was heavy, so when the invitation came for a seat on the King's Council, she took it and left this place of sadness behind her, which was when she met me, so soon after losing her own child, Haille said. She loves you, I know. Sometimes I think she loves me more than my own kin does. I know little of kings, but I know men. There may be more to your father than we can see. Considering all Haille had just learned of Yona, he could not deny the possibility. I wish I had confided in her more before I left on this journey. She might have been able to help. Or, more likely, would have told you that you are ideal the way you are. If only my father thought so. Maybe she would tell me The whole endeavour is a fool's quest." "I somehow doubt that," Lorna said, her eyes sparkling with the reflected light of the fire. "Yona knows the legends about the font, and these parts are taken as fact. It's even said that before it closed, the workers in the old Moorbright diamond mine stumbled upon the entrance to the font, but were unable to open it." Haille sat up. "So it is true." Lorna wrapped and unwrapped her fingers around her cup, tapping her nails on its side. "Well, as true as a legend can be. Well, even if it's just a legend, I have to try to find it. I know. That is why I will help you." Chapter 23. Thestos. The stars in the east over the mountains were fading and the sky was an inky blue when Haille set out the next morning. Lorna walked him down to the bank of the Liam where 2 men of the manor waited with a rowboat. Lorna gave Haille a blessing. To which gods or spirits she mumbled he did not ask, but he felt an odd sensation as she laid her hands on his shoulders and his head. "We are a long way from the edicts of the Inquisitors here." She sent him off with a kiss to the forehead and guided him towards the waiting boat. The men took him across the swift waters in silence, the only noise that of the water lapping on the hull and the oars in the oarlocks. The opposite bank came quickly enough, as the Liam was not a wide river, more of a deep channel that cut between the arrowhead of land that was the Dread Harn and the rising sentinel hills of Thestos. Haille thanked the men. Each nodded in turn, but kept their silence as if this transition from one bank to another was somehow a sacred ritual and words were too profane to be uttered. He crossed the towpath where donkeys would walk, pulling barges north against the current to Falum and the ungoverned northern territories. The hills began immediately, and instead of striking up the nearest slope, Haille took Lorna's advice, walking south until he came upon a stone post depicting the distance to Rivertown on one side and the leagues to Falum on the other. From there he turned into a gap between the hills where a disused path ran eastward. It was overgrown and springy with moss, but was easier to walk than where the hillsides were thick with heather. So he made his way under the morning stars. It did not take long for signs of the river, Rivertown, even the Rimcurs, to be eclipsed by the steep slopes rising all around him. They were not nearly as high as the mountain range to the east, but they were sharp and rose like the frozen waves of a storm at sea. Haille could see why they were referred to by some as the Lost Hills, since it was easy to become disoriented walking through their valleys and glens. Without trees or other landmarks, each looked like the one before it. A few times he clambered to the top of one of the hills just to check his bearings. His heart would pound in his chest from the climb, his breath coming hard, his legs soaked with the morning dew from the heather. The view was worth the climb. From the top he could see the Rimcurs rising in all their snowy coldness, the sun rays beginning to pass among their peaks, but its warmth no threat to their layers of ice. The Liam and Rivertown were already lost. He put his hand on the rucksack Lorna and Sorrel had packed for him. It was a reminder of when he was surrounded by companions, and some hope that he would be with friends again at the end of this journey. Lorna had provided him with a trifold parchment map that he consulted throughout the day. It depicted the road he was on now, a snaking line threading among the foothills until it reached the rising wall of the Rimcurs. It was the route used by the diamond miners in the heyday of the Moorbright mine, and now that she had pointed it out to him, Haille could pick out the saw-tooth ridge that was Moorbright Mountain. It was neither the highest nor the lowest, but its height did not matter since he was not going to be climbing to its top. The mine was halfway up, just short of the snow line, according to his hostess. Lorna had said the mine itself had ceased to produce gemstones decades before. It faded from memory, became a mere curiosity, eventually more of a legend. After it was a place of fortune, it became a place of foul luck, collapses and cave-ins taking the lives of the occasional prospectors daring enough to brave its crumbling tunnels. For a moment, anxiety flared within him as he wondered what he would do if the entire mine had collapsed in the intervening years. To come so close and to be foiled would have been a sad fate, but he pushed such thoughts aside and focused on trudging along the grass-choked road, following the old wheel ruts with his feet, noting the occasional marker with leagues to the mine still carved on its face. The shade of evening came early in the glens between the marching hills. He ate his supper of bread, cheese, and smoked beef on a ridgetop, taking in the last rays of the day, looking back and reflecting on the lands he had crossed. Farmers' fields, swamps, forests, and now moors, all to arrive at this place where he did not even feel like himself anymore. He found a depression cut into the hill by heavy rains that was lined with dry rocks and sand. The banks to either side provided good windbreaks, so he settled himself between them to sleep that night. He felt safe, laying there, drifting off to sleep, the stars winking at him through the swaying grass blades. He woke before dawn. A frost settled on his clothes, his breath a smoking cloud about his head. The sky was still a dark indigo, but it was too cold to sleep any longer. Even curling into himself beneath his blanket offered him no relief, so he wrapped it up, stuffed it back into his rucksack, and started east once more, stamping his feet to drive off the cold. The sky lightened, turning the clouds among the mountain heads red, then rose, then fiery orange until mid-morning when they burned away completely and the sunlight warmed the air. Blue bonnets growing on the slopes of the hills opened and Haille stopped for breakfast. He spent much of the rest of the morning and most of the day feeling as if he had just heard a cry or a whinny from a horse. Multiple times he climbed up to the top of the nearest hill to survey his surroundings, but aside from the occasional hawk, he was alone. The ground was changing. The soil became rockier while the sheer granite face of the Rimcurs and its brows crowned in snow fields were coming into focus. A few times when he stopped to fill his canteen from a stream or just to rest, he thought he felt the ground trembling. He knew earthquakes were not uncommon in the mountains, but these tremors were quick and fleeting, and he was never sure if they were the result of his own aching muscles twitching or something subterranean. It was not until the afternoon when he relaxed next to a stream that he became certain that the earth beneath him was shaking. The water was limpid and the surface clear and braided with the crisscross of rifles as it flowed over smooth stones. But an unmistakable tremor set the edges of the stream trembling in time with the vibrations Haille felt up through his body. As if to confirm his suspicions, a few rocks tumbled and clacked into one another before plunking into the water. With a hand pressed to the ground, he felt something familiar, a cadence he knew from parade ground and practice fields. He gathered up his belongings, stuffing his canteen into his rucksack and arms through the straps. Again he heard a horse's whinny. He was not alone. Out of instinct, he rushed for a boulder to hide himself, just as the first shape crested the ridge. One followed another, and soon an entire river of mounded muscle and flying manes coursed down the hillside. Stallions, mares, foals, unsaddled, shaggy, and wild. Not one bore a rider or saddle. Their coats instead were flecked with mud, their manes long and unkempt. Thestos wilds. Haille had heard of the wild horses of the moors, but he had never imagined he would see them or be in their midst. They trampled the heather, the bushes shivering and shaking before disappearing completely under their hooves. They turned down the road like water flowing into a channel. Haille climbed up on the boulder just as they flowed around him, the air filled with their scent, sweet grassy breath, a hovering cloud of dust, and trampled heather. Their manes shone, and their eyes roved all over him, a strange and peculiar shape intruding on their territory of hills, heather, and wonder. The last of the herd passed. Haille followed their tracks around the next hill to find them spread out in a meadow of belly-high grass. Their momentum had dissipated, and now they grazed and played, foals nipping at each other and galloping in circles about their mothers. The mountains in their majesty, the golden medallion of the sun, the sea of hills were all upstaged by the moving, carousing show that was the wild herd. For an hour or so, Haille forgot the urgency of his own task. Instead, he simply sat, watching the horses in their element, envying them their eternal present. It was only when the shadows turned in the hills and stretched to the east that Haille was reminded of the passage of time and the quest he was on. The font and its promise of healing called him. He left the horses behind, staring up into the long path ahead of him, and felt lonelier than he had in days. It wasn't even as cold as it had been the other evenings, but when he came upon the fallen remnants of a dried and withered tree, he gathered bundles of grass, broke off what branches he could, and started a fire. Sleep did not come easily this night. His mind was restless, and in the flames he thought he could see the shapes of other pilgrims like himself, twisted with deformities, limping with palsy, or bent with sclerosis, pinning their hopes foolishly on a legend, on superstition and rumors of magic and healing. Eventually he slept, waking occasionally to add wood to the fire, but it became difficult to distinguish his lucid moments of wakefulness from dreams. For it seemed that in both he was tending the fire to keep the flames high and the shadows at bay, shadows that coalesced into faces, long faces of wandering, curious horses, searching faces of cripples and freaks like himself, and more familiar faces of accusation, starting with Garn, but replaced by Cody, Val, and Katlyn. He prayed that it was not their ghosts he saw, but just his own guilt manifest. He had been such a fool to leave them. Then again he welcomed his loneliness like a punishment he deserved, the exile he always expected. He woke to footsteps and voices. He startled up just as someone yanked him by his collar and dragged him across the ground, his legs kicking up sparks from the remnants of his fire. The man dragging him picked him up only to unsheath Haille's dagger and pitch him forward face down into the grass. In the brief spell of falling, Haille glimpsed horses with riders and armed men to all sides. The sun was obscured behind clouds that covered the sky, but he sensed it was late morning. When he had finally slept, he had dropped into a deep sleep that had carried him past the dawn and left him exposed in the open to be found. He rolled over to take in familiar shapes and figures as if his dream had been a premonition. Vandale's, the man with the mangled hands, sat astride his horse, his men mounted beside him except for Silas, who had dragged him up and now looked down in amusement at Haille's alarm. But it was the other figures that drew Haille's attention even more, his heart dilating in his chest. Tied in slaves' links to a horse, their mouths gagged, their eyes a mixture of pity and pleading, were his friends, Val, Cody, and Katlyn, the very friends he had sent away, betrayed he could see now. The road had been harshest on Katlyn. She had been forced to march in stockings that had grown torn and ragged and soiled with filth. Through the holes he could see her feet were blistered and bloodied. All three of them looked thinner as if their gags had not been removed to let them eat, their eyes wide and sunken in their faces. Even the elk, that had so miraculously defeated the riders previously, was captured and bound so that it could walk but not run, its mouth clamped in a metal muzzle as if it were a rabid dog. Haille did not try to get up. What dignity or defiance he still had he would not surrender by standing, only to let this brute, Silas, shove him down once more. Vandale's crossed his arms over the pommel of his saddle and leaned forward. "Well, here we are," he said. Another man dismounted, picked up Haille's rucksack and upended it, shaking the contents onto the ground. His canteen, foodstuffs, and the map fell onto the grass. The man picked up the map and handed it to Vandale's. He pinched its edges with the fingers he had left and unfolded it. "What do you want?" Haille asked. "The same thing you seek. The font." "It's a legend. Superstition at best. What do you want with it?" "Don't play me for a fool. You didn't come all this way for a legend," Vandale said, the blades on his wrists catching the sunlight as he adjusted his remaining fingers on the reins. "A magical fountain that heals cripples and freaks," Haille said in as dismissive a tone as he could muster. "That grants the wishes of children so born with deformities or ailments. Who said a child must be so selfish as to ask to be healed? No. We find the font, and you will wish for what I tell you to wish." "That's preposterous. How can you make me?" "I'll kill your friends. That is how." The crushing feeling came back to Haille's chest. His heart beat in his throat, while a pain formed in his temple and radiated down his face. "No. No, you won't cooperate? Or no, I should not kill them," Vandale said, his smile flashing. He signaled one of his men who dismounted, drew his sword, and placed the point at Katlyn's throat. "I'll cooperate," Haille sputtered. The swordsman smiled, amused by Haille's quick acquiescence, or perhaps he was just drunk on power. He went to sheathe his sword, but Vandale spoke up. "Wait," he said, holding up his right hand where he was missing his smallest finger, the one next to it, and part of the middle one. 10 fingers is a lot. Truth be told, one can learn how to manage with fewer. Say 7. Silas, chop off 3 of her fingers just to show the prince we are serious." "Please don't," Haille begged. but the rest of the dozen men dismounted. It only took one man to hold down Katlyn and pin her hand to the fallen tree Haille had slept beside. She cried out through her gag, her voice muffled but her fear unmistakable. The other men preemptively struck Val and Cody's knees, forcing them to kneel. Even the elk was ready to fight. It took 4 men to wrestle it into submission. Its eyes rolled wildly and spit shot from its mouth, but like the rest of them, it was helpless. "Please, you don't have to do this." Yes, I do," Vondale said, and waved his hand. When it was finished, Katlyn hugged her mangled hand to her chest. She cried out at first, but soon mastered herself, instead staring with hatred at Vondale's. "Remarkable young woman," Vondale said. "Bind her wounds. I don't want her bleeding to death. We will need her for leverage later." "Katlyn, I'm so sorry," Haille said, but never had his words felt so hollow. They wrapped her hand with strips ripped from Haille's blanket, the 2 remaining fingers standing rigid next to the space where the others had been. Cody moved to carry her, but she refused, choosing to walk as best she could, although after a few minutes she fainted and he caught her as she fell to her knees. Vondale consulted the map and sent the men on ahead. Instead of tying Haille to the horse with his friends, he was added to Silas's horse, tied up next to another prisoner he had not noticed before. The man was dressed in fine sable riding pants. His shirt was linen but hung open, as if ripped apart during a struggle. Unlike the others, he was not gagged, so as Haille was tied up next to him, he could study the stranger's face, his thin lips, narrow nostrils, and slanted, widely placed eyes. He had fine skin and looked to have lived a comfortable life, but he was not handsome. His face was too serpentine for that. Strangely, he reminded Haille of Vondale's. Vondale's was already galloping off to catch up with the others. Silas stepped away into the grasses to relieve himself. Haille's mind was a jumble, his stomach felt sick and his mouth tasted of bile. It took a moment for him to realize that the man next to him was whispering. "I am sorry for your friend," he said. "I promise you will be avenged." Haille looked askance at him, afraid to speak back lest Silas hear him and punish them both. But the man was bold. "My name is Sade." Chapter 24. More Bright Mine. The wind grew biting as they climbed the rest of the day. They did not stop to eat and only stopped occasionally to drink and rest the horses. At times Haille stumbled, but Sade helped him to his feet, encouraging him, promising him revenge. "You just must endure," he whispered as he picked Haille up again. The clouds remained low in the sky, obscuring the mountain tops and the sun. A little after noon, Silas stopped to water his horse from a stream and to help himself to some of the smoked beef from Haille's rucksack. Silas ate the cheese as well, but tossed a fistful of bread from the loaf baked by Sorel to Haille and Sade. The piece tumbled through the dirt, but Haille still picked it up. He offered a piece to Sade, but his fellow prisoner shook his head. "You need it more than I." His accent was a strange one that Haille had never heard before. "Where are you from?" Haille asked, checking to make sure Silas was out of earshot. "What do they want with you?" "I am from Great Port. It is an island city to the southwest of Carson's. It is a long story of how I came to be here, but what they want from me is my power." "Power?" Sade lifted his hands. "Bound, I am unable to conjure, but freed, I am a sorcerer." Haille stopped chewing. "Truly?" "Yes. In your kingdom such things are forbidden, but it does not mean they do not exist. The realm of Ansor is a backward place. Those with the gifts of magic avoid it, for your inquisitors are not friends of ours. Where I am from, the men and women with the gift ply their trade like any other tradesman. They work the weather on their ships, mix healing potions, and some can even weave elaborate illusions." "Can you free us?" "Alas, I cannot," Sade said. "I am but a humble sorcerer. I am no archmage. I can work the weather, but I know no spells of power that give life or destroy it. Those are arts long lost, practiced by only the most wise of magi, of which only a small handful exist." "But why are you here?" Haille said, taking a bite of the bread. "The door to the font is enchanted. One needs a charm to open it, so they will need me." "What will they do with us?" "As long as they have need for us, they will keep us alive. They need me for the door, "I need you for the wish," Sade said, adjusting his chains. "In the font?" "Yes, but these are dangerous, greedy men. Who knows what they will force you to wish for?" "I'll wish for them all to die, and for us to be released," he said, twisting his wrists inside his manacles. "From a grace that is a healer, I think not. Jasmeen is a different kind of spirit than that. From what I know, she builds on a kernel of strength and power that must already be present. She is no killer," Sade said, looking up into the mountain peaks as if he saw Jasmeen waiting for them there. "Then what do they hope to force me to wish for?" "Power. Power for them so that they are unstoppable. If you don't, your friends are dead." Silas returned and they both went quiet. After checking their bindings, he started off again, his horse wheezing and grunting in the thinning air. The vegetation grew more sparse and soon the path was one of rocks with only the occasional laurel bush or bayberry tree defying the wind and the cold. The road hugged close to one of the main ridges running up into the mountain's heart. The ground dropped away on either side, leaving them exposed to the wind racing across the defile. Haille could see their numbers stretching out over a distance. He could make out the elk by the way its lowered head caught the light in its antlers, and he believed he could recognize Val and Cody, one of them still carrying Katlyn, but he could not be sure. What he was certain of was that the riders were well provisioned. For every mounted horse there were 2 donkeys laden with tools for digging. The line of men and animals stretched for a great distance over the rising and falling ridge. They camped in a ravine where they were protected from the worst of the wind. As on the march, they kept Haille and Sade separate from the other prisoners. Their treatment was not equal. Haille and Sade were allowed to sit next to one of the fires and were even given pieces of smoked meat to eat. They were hardly filling portions, but it was more than was offered to Val, Cody, and Katlyn. Haille asked if some of the bread he was offered could be shared with the other prisoners. The men burst out laughing. "A noble sentiment lost on those brutes," Sade said. "Look out for yourself while you can and eat the bread. A wise warrior has patience and saves his strength for the well-timed attack." The mine was a wound that marred the mountainside. When they crested the last ridge and it came into view just below the snow line, there was no mistaking it. The entrance was a yawning black mouth, the slope below it covered in a vomit of tailings that spread hundreds of feet down the slope to the bottom of the ravine where the waste stone bled off into a river, turning at the color of rust and blood. Vandales and his men unpacked torches, lanterns, shovels, and pickaxes and set up a base camp of sorts just inside the entrance. Haille would have been happy to be left outside, but Vandales wanted all the prisoners inside where they could be kept close. Even the elk was dragged into the darkness of the mine's chambers. Once Haille's eyes adjusted, he realized there was room enough for them and more, for the first chamber was a hollow space that ran in all directions. So much stone had been cut away that only timbers placed throughout the chamber kept the ceiling from caving in. The beams themselves were old, withered and cracking. Some had split and shattered completely. The ceiling about them collapsed in a pile of rubble as the mountain took back the space that was its own. The men tied the prisoners to timbers, each facing away from one another. Amid a pile of abandoned equipment, the men found a cauldron which they scrubbed out and set over a fire. Everyone ate well that night, Vandales allowing all the prisoners to eat, but not to talk. "You'll need your strength tomorrow," he said to them. After a night of fitful sleeping, Haille woke to the sound of Silas and another one of the men standing up a few steps away from him, relieving themselves. "I swear, Lorig, I heard footsteps in the night," Silas was saying. "Just the timbers settling. We would have seen anyone coming in the entrance." "The place is huge. There could be other entrances," Silas said. "So there is some crazy old tramp who lives up here. What do we do, turn back?" "He could be a prospector, looking for leftover gems. He might not want to share." "Then we kill him." Both men laughed, finished their business, and walked away. Haille crinkled his nose at the smell left over, but soon forgot it. He had other things to consider. For instance, if indeed they were not alone in the mines, who was it that was there with them? Could they help Haille and his friends? If there were others in the mine, they did not show themselves that morning. All but 2 of the men followed Vandales into the murk of the mine, the others remaining behind to guard them. There was little to do but sit. When the guards were not looking, Haille worked at his bindings, rubbing them against one another until his wrists pained him, but the knots held fast. Haille was turned so that he could not see his friends, but he could see Sade tied to his timber, dozing peacefully, at least until Silas returned from the depths of the tunnels and woke him.
"Come on, magician! Time to earn your keep,"
he said. "You found something?"
"Sure thing. Vandales is quite happy."
All the men came along this time, dragging the prisoners, the donkeys and the elk with them. Haille thought it impractical until he realized that the mine had more secrets to reveal. Beyond the first chamber with its creaking timbers and collapsing ceiling was a natural cavern with teeth of stalagmites and stalactites lining the floor and archways. A river of white water cascaded through the center of the cavern before disappearing again under the mountain. Throughout the room still stood a marvel of engineering. Conveyor belts, driven by a water wheel, ran the length of the cavern. Heaps of raw stone waited in piles alongside. The apparatus still worked, and two of Vandale's men started to pile rocks onto the belts where they were fed in between two massive rollers that crushed them. A series of grates sifted through the debris on the other side where a third man looked for gemstones. The wheels and gears, long without oil, groaned and squealed, but the boulders still moved down the belts, lodged between the rollers and shattered with loud pops. The group continued through a mixture of natural caverns and man-made shafts. The air was stale and smoky from the lanterns. In some of the larger caverns they passed through, the burning lights barely illuminated the darkness overhead and the ceiling was lost in gloom. The shafts bottomed out, then pitched upward. Haille was heartened to see natural light filtering through the air ahead of them. Sure enough, the mine shaft opened into a narrow ravine with sheer walls on either side. It was nothing more than a gap between cliffs, narrow enough that a man could touch both sides with outstretched arms. The floor was nothing but rubble, rockfall from centuries that shifted and clacked underfoot. The mules and even the elk struggled on the shifting ground. The mercenaries and their prisoners passed other shafts that opened into the ravine, cold cavern air wafting out like the breath of the mountain. After rounding a narrow bend in the ravine, the weary crew came to an ornate doorway that was clearly carved with more skill than the miners who had infested the mountain like weevils possessed. On either side were stylized figures of women, their features elongated so that they stretched as high as the top of the opening. They were fierce and foreboding, their eyes narrow and disapproving. The door panels themselves were carved with depictions of flowing water and figures dancing in the waves, figures that were too diminutive to be adults. These were children, and as Haille neared the doors he could make out slings, crutches, and stretchers depicted on the shores of the healing waters, discarded by the children who had been healed upon submerging. Vandales and his men had formed a semicircle around the doors. The men parted as Sade came forward. "Come, Haille," he said, motioning to him with his bound hands. Haille chanced a glance at his friends. Cody and Katlyn were focused on the doors, but Val met his eyes and shook his head, as if to say, "No." But what choice did he have? He thought, looking at Katlyn's mangled hand. Vandale sliced the ropes on Sade's hands with the outsized knives fastened to his gauntlets. "Do your craft, magician," he said. Something about their exchange struck Haille as strange. But before he could consider it further, Sade shook his hands free of the ropes, stretched his arms in front of him, and rubbed his palms on the face of the doors. He closed his eyes, then commenced to whisper. Whether it was a song, a rhyme, or incantation, Haille was not sure. An inquisitor would surely object, but they were far from their narrow-minded jurisdiction. Certain sounds repeated themselves, but the language was incomprehensible to Haille. The others waited in silent stillness, all except for Silas, who was at the rear and spun back to scan the tunnels behind them. He rested his hand on the pommel of his sword, his fingers flexing. Haille focused again on the doors, his muscles tensed. The panels opened with a crack, followed by a heavy grinding noise as they slid to either side, propelled by invisible machinery or invisible forces. Haille knew not which. Vandales called for a lantern while Sade shielded his eyes and peered into the darkness. Smooth, polished columns lined a corridor, and from somewhere beyond came the sound of rushing water. Sade turned to Haille, extended his hand and opened his mouth, but it was not his voice that suddenly echoed in the chasm. "Halt!" Haille turned around. Standing at the edge of the mine shaft Silas had been peering up into, an arrow knocked back in her bow, the string drawn back so that it just touched her cheek below her eye, was Avenger Red. Silas cursed. It was then followed by the sound of drawing steel, even though the blades would be useless while Red held the high ground and kept her aim trained on them. Vondale's nostrils flared and his neck swelled. "Take me," Red said from the ledge.
"The font is for those crippled from birth.
"What could you want with it?" Sade said, shaking his hands toward the open doors.
"He knows my affliction,"
Red said, nodding at Haille.
"Affliction?"
Sade said. Haille's mind froze. How to explain Red's elaborate deception in few words? But in the end there was not time, for boulders rolled down the pathway of the ravine, and men dressed in the red and black colors of the House of Redmont appeared, heavily armed. At their fore, a long sword trembling in his hands, stood Ghaust Redmont.
"Father, what are you doing here?"
Red cried out, her brow furrowed.
"Shut your mouth, Gale. You've caused enough trouble already. These men took slaves that belonged to me, and they will learn not to cross the Redmont clan."
"But Lord Redmont,"
Vondale stepped forward, pointing upwards to Red with his sword.
"Your daughter made a deal with us."
"She is no daughter of mine. She has betrayed me."
"And it seems us as well,"
Vondale said.
"Let us sheathe our swords and discuss this as honorable men."
"Why should I parley when I have you outnumbered? Gale, get down here. We are leaving with what is ours. Nobody takes my property from me."
What was going through Red's mind, Haille could not have guessed. Ire at her father, the unraveling of her own plans, her desperation to be healed, all must have warred within her. Every set of eyes was turned to her, for their fates waited on her next move. Perhaps she knew exactly what she was doing, or perhaps she was just reacting recklessly. Whatever the case, she sprung her fingers and released the arrow at Vondale's. He was quicker than Haille could have imagined, for Vondale stepped aside and swung his armed forearm in a circle, deflecting the shaft. The arrow shot past Haille. He heard a fleshy thunk and a cough, but thought little of it because he was focused on Ghaust and his men charging down the ravine and clashing with Silas, who slew the first 2 men upon him. Then Haille saw the elk, unguarded in the chaos, gallop to Val and Cody, who lifted their hands up and sliced their ropes on its antlers. Cody set to unlatching the muzzle while Val, his face blanched, looked past Haille to a figure laying on the ground beside the open door.
"Katlyn,"
he said, ripping off his gag. Haille had not taken notice of where the stray arrow had gone. No one had until that moment. Katlyn had fallen, the shaft sticking out of her neck, a mess of blood pouring forth over her collar. Val's hands worked at the knots of her gag, loosened it, and pressed it against the wound. Her mouth uncovered, Katlyn coughed up a spray of blood. Her face was pale and her eyes pleading. Cody and the elk came behind Val, and Haille rushed to join them, but he was yanked backwards. He tottered into Sade's arms, who lifted him over the threshold of the doorway.
"You can't help her now. No one can."
Haille still reached for her, calling her name, horrified at the scene framed in the square of the doorway. Katlyn's prone body, Cody and the elk looking on, the flash and clang of steel beyond, and the twang of Red's bow. Val's blood-stained hands. But with a word, Sade motioned the doors to close. The stone obeyed and the scene was shut away in an aperture that grew smaller and smaller until all the light, all the fighting, was cut off and Haille stood in complete darkness. Chapter 25. The Font of Jasmeen.
"Orens potendus fulgunt aurorus."
Sade said the words and the darkness that enveloped them dissipated, a flame curling to life in his cupped palm. But there was no candle there, no torch, just a naked flame, a teardrop of flickering light that rested on the ends of his fingertips and pulsed with the flexing of his hands.
"Behold the power that you people fear,"
he said, the pleasure on his face like that of a performer taking pride in his skill. For a moment, Haille forgot the danger behind them and the possibilities ahead of them, and instead was transfixed on the floating flame that cast its light on the chamber. With only words and will, Sade had conjured fire from nothingness. The thrill of the forbidden made Haille's heart beat fast in his chest. The illumination cast a glow on columns and stone carvings of women, their shapes hinting at the greater statue that possibly waited for them at the end of the hall. But suddenly that possibility didn't matter, as Haille remembered his friend dying on the far side.
What about Katlyn?
We can only help them by finding the font,
Sade said, taking him by the arm and forcing him to walk down the hallway in front of him.
Time is running out.
Haille felt that he was in no position to argue with a man who could call forth fire from nothingness. And if fire could flare from a magician's fingertips, what other powers might be waiting for them at the end of the hall? Powers to heal, to cure. There were endless possibilities to set things right. Haille walked faster, breaking into a run. Sade followed. The rock of this chamber was different from the raw sort of the mine. The floors were a polished black stone. So were the columns along the walls, their capitals topped with jade stone. The statues of women between them seemed to move as the shadows from the flickering light slid over them. Natural light appeared at the end of the tunnel, slipping through the timbers of a heavy wooden door. Haille could hear the crash of water beyond it. Sade brought his hand and the flame close to the door and found an iron ring in the center that he lifted. It groaned and flakes of rust snowed down onto the floor. But with a push the door gave way and nothing less than a miracle of stone and dancing water appeared on the other side. Sade shook his fingers and the flame petered out of existence. It was not needed, for the light that filtered down was that of the sun. They were standing on a walkway that stretched across a long, open room carved out by an ancient waterfall, a piece of the blue sky open above them. Water rushed down the sides of the shaft in white sheets, splashing into a whirling pool a short drop below their feet. The surface of the pool churned and bubbled with currents. The air itself was alive with swirling droplets as if they were caught in a light rain. But the centerpiece of the room was the statue. Jasmeen stood as high as 5 men upon a plinth in the center of the pool so that they both had to strain their necks to see her face. There was no looking away. She was beautiful and magnificent, her proportions perfect. Her eyes alive, her entire body encased in an aura of rainbows. Even if her eyes were stone, Jasmeen had life to her. Water coursed down her body from the top of her headdress, flowing down her shoulders, caressing her breasts, and slipping down her arms where the streams leapt from her fingers to fall into 2 overflowing cisterns at her feet. The cisterns emptied into a larger pool that anchored her feet and was reached by the narrow walkway they were on.
Stand in the pool,
Sade said, goading Haille across the walkway. The rain of water from above became heavier as they approached the statue. The rock under their feet was slick with green growth, and Haille was relieved to step into the pool where there was at least a small boundary between him and the drop-off into the swirling waters below. His clothes were soon soaked through and his hair plastered on his head, but he felt no cold and gladly blinked his eyes free of the blinding water. Sade was soaked now too, but his face was also alight with opportunity and discovery. Haille felt his hands trembling. His knees shook. They had reached this point, the place in the heart of the mountain, lost in the depths of myth. Yet Jasmeen was real, like the flame conjured from nothing. If so much was real, what else was possible? So much to set right. Sade set his hands on Haille's shoulder, spitting as he yelled over the cascading water.
Now is the time, Haille. Everything has come to this. You must wish, but you must wish for the right thing. You only have one chance.
One chance. So much tumbled in his mind, not unlike the water falling all about them. He pictured his father and that word written by his hand. Disappointment. He pictured himself in an orphanage full of children who could not feed or clean themselves, who could not speak for their disabilities. With the right words, he could wish it all away. The possibility flooded his mind like a gift from the goddess herself. But as soon as it came into focus, it was replaced by another vision. Katlyn, laying on the ground, an arrow in her throat. The same person who had helped him in the library, hugged him at the carnival, the same person he had tripped in the street and who had shown such ferocity in protecting herself and him from the Inquisitors. This girl of bravery and secrets was now dying in a wasteland of stone. He realized then nothing else mattered. Sade shook him from his thoughts.
Haille, now is the time to make your wish.
But I don't know the right words to use.
Sade's grip on his shoulders tightened.
You want to avenge your friends? Protect yourself? Heal yourself? Then help me defeat them. Help give me power. Say it. Say, give Sade the power of his masters. The power over life and death. The power of the Kryen.
The Kryen? Say it!
Sade sneered and shook him. As he did, his shirt came open and something shiny caught Haile's eye. An amulet shaped like a broken ring. He had seen that shape before. The water made such an indomitable noise in his head, in his mind. It was like the explosion of so many thoughts at once. The clamor of a crowd, the chaos of a storm. But Haille understood something in that moment. It was as if the goddess whispered it in his ear. It was not power that the waters offered. What was offered was not dominion over others, the exercise of hurt, but rather the love of healing. And he knew the wish in his own heart resonated with that intention. He no longer held any desire for himself to be healed. He had lived all his life with his affliction. He could live with it longer. But he could not live without friends. He wished now just for Katlyn to be healed. He didn't even say it. He knew the goddess heard him.
Haille,
Sade grunted.
Haille, says the words.
No.
What?
I don't want power, for you or for me. I don't even want to be healed myself. I just want my friend back. The water coursed down around them, clapping on the stone and fanning out about them to slide off the edge of the walkway. It was a course that had not been interrupted for centuries, and yet here they were disturbing it, yet one with its flow. Their clothes hung heavy on them, their eyes blinking away stray drops, rivulets tracing their features the same way they traced Jasmeen's. Sade's jaw twitched before he lifted his right arm away. Haille still did not expect the blow. He would have fallen over when Sade struck his face if the magician was not already holding him with his other arm. He punched Haille a second time. Haille tasted blood in his mouth as Sade kicked out his legs from under him and forced him to kneel down in the pool. Sade's face was twisted with hate.
You stupid freak,
he said, taking Haille's arm and twisting it behind him. Haille was his puppet, and Sade dunked him face first into the pool. Haille strained, but he was no match for the strength of an adult. The green algae-covered stone was just inches from his face. A string of his own blood swirled upwards past his face. Just when he thought his lungs would burst and his mouth would give way and inhale the water, Sade yanked him up.
Say the words, Haille. Give me the power or you die.
Fine. I wish you the power.
Of the Kryen.
Of the Kryen. With that, Sade tossed Haille down into the pool. Haille staggered on all fours to the base of the statue and wrapped his arms around Jasmeen's slender ankles, a child crouching at the feet of a parent. Sade stepped away onto the walkway that connected the statue to the cave wall. Haille watched as Sade drew his knife, touched the blade to the back of his forearm, and then, with his teeth bared, cut his own flesh. The blood ran freely down his arm. His muscles flexed and his tendons corded under his skin. For a long while he studied the wound, a gash shaped like a frown that only opened wider the longer he stared. He snapped his head back around on Haille, the broken ring bouncing on his chest.
It should have healed.
He swept towards Haille, the knife lowered towards his neck. Haille already knew it was too late, already knew Sade was unworthy. The quest for power was not favored by Jasmeen or rewarded by her. Haille pushed himself up to his feet.
You're one of them. You are just like Vendale's and the others,
he said, his arms wrapped around the statue for balance, even as his feel slipped with every effort he made to right himself.
No,
Sade said, the water falling about him like a malevolent storm.
I am worse.
In 2 quick strides, he collared Haille and threw him towards the edge of the walkway, the impact knocking the wind clean out of his chest. Haille struggled to breathe, gasping like a dying fish, when Sade kicked him, sending him sloshing towards the drop-off. Haille dug his fingers into a crevice between the 2 stones. He felt his fingernails peeling back as he fought for purchase. Sade stepped out of the pool and by a stroke of luck, slipped himself, falling on the slick stone, his knife skittering towards the edge where the flow of water carried it over into the roiling pool below. While Sade tried to right himself, Haille rolled against the current and splashed up onto the bridge. He heard Sade sloshing through the water behind him. Winded and wounded from the kick to his ribs, Haille could not call upon the speed he needed. The door was still out of his reach when Sade tackled him from behind and shoved him to the ground. Haille slid along with the cascading water towards the edge once more. His entire world was reduced to the most basic elements. He was struggling for air, slipping in water, trying to find a handhold on stone, and he was looking into fire.
Orens potendus!
Sade began flexing his fingers, the flames stoking to life. Haille remembered the words. He was desperate now. Could the trick be so hard? He would grasp at straws, any straws. He held out his own hand just as Sade sent a wall of fire down upon him. The heat turned the water in his clothes to steam. "Orens pretendis!" Haille cried. The flames spread out around him, but they were held at bay, bending around him in a concave shape as if an invisible shield had formed around Haille long enough for the fire to flare and then sizzle into nothingness. Sade looked struck, his arms still outstretched, his mouth agape. Haille was trembling and dared not move. "You have the gift," Sade said in puzzlement. "It's a shame, boy. I could have trained you to be a servoir, but you've already shown yourself to be too soft. Let that be the only spell you cast in your short, crippled waste of a life." He dispensed with magic or any further waiting. Sade kicked Haille again. This time, expecting it, Haille threw himself onto Sade's thigh, throwing off his opponent's balance and holding on as they both slipped on the treacherous stone. Hands, feet, knees, elbows splashed. Haille gagged on water that he breathed in with a gulp of air. Sade was on his side as Haille made for the wooden door, reaching for the rusted iron ring of a handle. But he was still not quick enough to elude Sade, who swung his legs out to trip Haille. Blood spilling from his gashed arm, Sade grabbed Haille and pushed him towards the ledge. Water flowed right into Haille's face, making the world an unfocused blur. But he knew his time was up. Sade was standing over him again, lifting his boot to smash down on Haille's hands that were grasping at the edge of the walkway. Haille tensed, anticipating the strike. But it did not come. Instead, he opened his eyes to see a flash of Sade's broken ring as he slid past, over the ledge, and into the water with a splash. Haille's view above was obscured by the wooden door with the iron ring that had swung open and like a giant arm had swept Sade off the bridge and into the water. 10 fingers appeared at the edge of the door. A face framed in red hair peered around at him. "Haille! Katlyn!" She pushed aside the door, threw herself on the ground, and offered her hands, her intact, unwounded hands, to Haille to grab. He took them at once, pulled himself up, and embraced her. "You're alive!" "I know," she said, pulling aside her blood-stained collar to show a neck free of wounds. "There was a flash of light, and the arrow was gone, and my fingers." "We're back," Haille said, examining them. "Haille, did you spend your wish on me?" "I had to." "But what about—" "It doesn't matter. Friends do." Haille was not sure if it was water from the falls or tears on Katlyn's face, but she wiped her eyes and they both made for the door where Cody and Val had just come to a stop. "By the gods almighty," Cody said, looking up at the statue. Val, instead, was looking to Haille and helped him over the threshold of the doorway. "Whatever you did right." "Thanks." With a sudden, deep crack, the statue bent at the waist and tumbled down, striking the walkway and shattering it. A wall of foamy water rose up. "What is happening?" Cody said. "She has exhausted her powers," Haille said, although how he knew, he could not be sure. The sides of the shaft were beginning to crumble, and sections of rocks tumbled down the sides. "I think we should go."